Welcome to First Parish Unitarian Universalist Northborough. We Unitarian Universalists are a non-creedal, religiously liberal faith tradition. We hold in our worship and in our faith formation that each individual and each community will explore a wide and varied set of beliefs and ideas that encourage us to live life as a spiritual journey, deepening our connections to compassion, justice, and an understanding of eternal truths. I am Reverend Abigail Stockman, the interim co-minister, and I serve with my colleague, Reverend Misty Dawn Shelley. If you have any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to be in touch with one of us or both of us. We are a community in multiple locations, so let's take a moment to greet one another by waving to those online and those around us until the chime is rung. And those online, please wave back. For holy days on which we recall old stories, we light the flame. For Passover, which reminds us of the courage and strength of those seeking freedom in the past, we light the flame. For Easter, which reminds us that love is our greatest challenge, we light the flame. For gathering today in this sacred space and in our sacred spaces online, we light the flame. For the opportunity to be together as a community, to remember the past, to plan for the future, and to be alive in the present. We light the flame. Come, let us begin our worship. Rise in spirit, body, as you are able, with hymn number 151 in the gray hymnal, I Wish I Knew How. And those of you who may be in my generation of life might remember this song from your folk hippie days. Time for all ages this morning. There won't be as many stories this week as last, I promise. But this story is a retelling of the story of Miriam's sister prophet dancer. It comes out of the Hebrew scripture. This was written for our Tapestry of Faith curriculum, and I'm going to adapt it a little bit. So it said that for many years, the Hebrew people were slaves in Egypt. A slave, as you know, works hard for no pay, is not allowed to say or do what they want. They are usually a person owned by another person. In Egypt, a young Hebrew girl named Miriam was a slave. Her mother and father and brother were all slaves as well. And they weren't happy being slaves. But at the same time, it worked. They didn't plan to change their situation. That would have taken a lot of energy. And they didn't see how to do that. So it just didn't seem possible to escape from the situation they were in. As it would happen, it would. in fact, happen, and Miriam's family would be right in the middle of it. The Egyptian king, the Pharaoh, was worried about the Hebrew slaves. He'd had some dreams, he'd had some of his advisors suggest he might continue to be a little worried about that. He needed their hard work as builders and farmers to do things for the free Egyptian people. But he was afraid that these slaves, these Hebrew slaves, would try and escape. And he was especially worried, had been told to worry about the young boys who would grow up to be strong men who could fight for their freedom. So he made a rule that all the baby boys would need to be killed. He sent the soldiers to all of the slaves' homes, all of the Hebrew homes, to take away their baby boys. Around this very same time, Miriam's own mother gave birth to a baby boy. Her mother and Miriam were both frightened and both wanted to protect this son. Her mother wove a basket out of some grasses, placed the baby inside it, and sent the basket floating down the river in hopes that someone would find the baby and save him. It was hard to let her little baby go, but it seemed like the only way for him to have life and to survive. Miriam was frightened too, watching her mother do this. She watched this little baby brother float by in the long reeds that poked above the water. She tried, when she went out from her family, to act as if nothing was wrong, nothing strange. They didn't want anyone to know they had done this with the baby boy. If a soldier walked by and saw her and she gave it away, what would happen? She saw some women in the water up ahead where the basket was floating, and they were washing clothes. And as the basket floated toward them, she kept creeping closer. She saw it was the Pharaoh's daughter with her maids. Miriam held her breath in fear as the women saw the basket. "Look, a baby," one of them said. "How lovingly someone has wrapped this baby. It must be a little Hebrew boy." Miriam was sure the Pharaoh's daughter would pick the baby up, deliver him to the soldiers, and have him killed. But that's not what happened. "What a beautiful baby," Pharaoh's daughter cried. "I'll raise him myself as a prince of Egypt." One of her maids said, "You know, your father's going to be angry if you do that. All the Hebrew baby boys are supposed to be killed." "I don't care," said the Pharaoh's daughter, and she picked up Miriam's brother and held him in her arms. Miriam got very brave in that moment, and she stepped forward towards the women and she said, I can find a Hebrew woman to take care of this baby for you." Of course, she was thinking of her very own mother. And Pharaoh's daughter thought Miriam's idea was a good one, and she sent Miriam to get a Hebrew nursemaid. And of course, she ran to get her own mother. And this is how her baby brother survived Pharaoh's terrible rule and got to live with his own family, at least for a while he was being nursed. Once he began to walk and talk, Pharaoh's daughter took him back with her. She named him Moses, and he grew up in the Pharaoh's palace as an Egyptian prince. Miriam, too, was growing up, and she would see her brother from time to time. She believed in her heart that he remembered her, that he would remember that he was really a Hebrew, but she wasn't entirely sure about this. They lost track of Miriam's family for a while. Moses had killed an Egyptian who was beating a slave. So he ran away, he became a shepherder, and he got married. One day, Moses saw a bush on fire, and he understood that to bring a message from the God of the Hebrew people. The message let Moses know that he was no Egyptian prince, but a Hebrew whose family were all slaves. A Hebrew with a very special mission: to return to Egypt, to lead the Hebrew people out of slavery to a new land, to be free. Moses returned to Egypt. His adopted grandfather, the old Pharaoh, had died. There was a new Pharaoh, and Moses began asking him for the Hebrews' freedom. But the Pharaoh refused. Moses asked again and again, and the Pharaoh just kept refusing. And then a series of disasters you've probably heard about before occurred. A disease killed the cattle. Frogs rained down from the sky. Swarms of locusts ate the Egyptians' crops. Finally, Pharaoh changed his mind. It was enough. He wanted the Hebrews gone. Miriam and her family rushed to pack, and they hurried to leave because they knew a king like Pharaoh might just change their mind and decide they weren't really going to let that free labor go. And sure enough, after everyone packed, gathered their belongings, the Pharaoh, in fact, did change his mind, but the Hebrews left Egypt, the children, the women, and the men, with Egyptian soldiers in pursuit. Miriam had helped to rescue her brother when he was a baby, and now, with her brothers, Moses and Aaron, she would help to rescue the Hebrew people and other slaves from their hard life in Egypt. At the moment of great fear, she had faith they would escape. With Moses and Aaron, she led the others, keeping steps ahead of the Egyptians. And they came to a large sea, the Red Sea, and the Hebrews bravely crossed the water, finding to their great surprise a dry path through it. The Egyptians came after them, but the dry path became covered with water when the Egyptians arrived there, and they could not reach the Hebrews on the other side. Miriam's people would face many hard years of wandering before they found a land where they could settle down and build community in freedom. Build community in freedom. Hold on to that sentence. There would be more challenges ahead, but they kept believing they would find a new home, and from each disaster, they bounced back. After the Hebrews crossed the Red Sea, leaving Egypt in slavery forever, Miriam lifted a tambourine high in the air and led the people in a song and a dance. And yes, an uncertain road lay ahead, and terrible things behind, and good things behind, and good things ahead. But there was a great joy to feel now and deep gratitude to express. With that, we will have a song of joy, a choral welcome to spring. If the choir would please come forward. As the choir prepares, I meant to notice in our welcome how blue we look today and how wonderful it is to see so many in blue. How wonderful it is that those of us who were able to come in some version of blue today, and here's what I think. Purple, lavender, green, they all have some blue in them. So just remember that we are supporting today World Autism Day, and it's World Autism Day, and the entire month is devoted to understanding autism. On that note, let us sing with joy. In the soft earth beneath our dry feet, the earth she moves and moans anew. And we are called to plant our seedlings with sacred deeds of deepening hues. Across the blue sky above our heads, the sun's warm rays come right to us. The wind lifts spirits from our kingdom. Our love psalm reaches to newfound heights. We give thanks for your living God. In this season of new beginning, our primavera calls to us now. The lily springtime keeps coming forth, rebirthing us from dark places. With rain and misting, they grow taller, and we grow deeper in good graces. As we emerge as siblings of faith, the spring tells us to show we care for one another and our mother, and let it be our solemn prayer. Joys and sorrows or concerns. let us continue in the spirit of prayer. Let us take some deep breaths in and out, that we may be as present as possible to hear our own still small voice. With these words to guide us from Ted Loder. Gentle me, O Holy One, into an unclenched moment, a deep breath, a letting go of heavy expectancies, of shriveling anxieties, of dead certainties, that, softened by the silence, surrounded by the light, and open to the mystery, I may be found by wholeness, upheld by the unfathomable, entranced by the simple, and filled with the joy that is you. Amen. The offering for the work of this congregation will be collected in a moment. As always, half of the plate will be shared. Today is the month of April, no fooling. And a request came to the team who made the half plate decisions this year recently from Jean Cahill. In 2021, Trinity Church, and these words come from Jean Leaf, who is a member of Trinity Church. In 2021, Trinity Church decided to sponsor a family after hearing about the evacuation of Afghan refugees. We knew this project was bigger than we could handle by ourselves, so we elicited the help of the community and quickly had a team of 25 people. Rose and her 7-year-old son, Mark, have now been here for a year. They were assigned by Centria Care in February 2022 to this settlement team. Centria Care is a resettlement nonprofit in Worcester. Trinity Church has been supporting the family for a year, but realized that with housing costs so high in Northborough, we will need to help them for longer. Our current fundraising push hopes to raise money to pay their rent for another 6 months. Rose is currently enrolled at Quinsigamond Community College, taking classes to improve her English, and she hopes to earn a certificate or associate's degree in a healthcare field so she can get a better paying job. There is a link to a Voice of America, there is a Voice of America feature video about Rose and Mark that was published on Voice of America's website on March 18th, 2023, if you're interested in finding your way to that. So the offering for the work of the church will gratefully be received. May it be gratefully given. Last Sunday, I read a story to you about the migration of the monarch butterflies. Migration and exodus. Exodus being the name for that in the Hebrew scriptures for the leaving from Egypt into the wilderness. So I wonder this, are we humans migrating from before COVID to what will be post-COVID? Especially those of us in this culture where we believed we were safe and protected from these kinds of catastrophic waves before this one hit? Or are we migrating, us humans, from life only a dozen to 15 years ago when not everyone had a home computer nor a smartphone that connected us to the internet? Or are these exoduses? And what's the difference? According to one online dictionary, a migration is not necessarily forced and may take place slowly or all at once, whereas an exodus is forced and happens in a short span of time. Migration can be coming or going. An exodus is a one-way ticket out. Wild creatures don't actually choose to migrate, as our story last week reminded us, but they or their species go and return. So we speak of migration. The etymology of exodus from Greek and then Latin was literally a going out, according to Edmund Line. I'm never going to say that right. From ex meaning out and hodos meaning a way, a path, a journey. I'm inclined toward a way out. Alice Blair Wesley, retired Unitarian Universalist minister, in her now famous 2000 Men's Lecture Series, spoke of our Puritan religious ancestors committing and covenanting to, quote, walk together in the way of, end quote. Back then, they were covenanting to walk in the way of Jesus. Today, we would say in the way of love. I'm going to interrupt us for a moment. Stephanie? Yes? Are we having a problem online? No. Okay. I heard you talking and I wanted to make sure people weren't missing. Back then, they would talk about covenanting to walk in the way of Jesus. Today, we would say in the way of love. Today, we probably wouldn't even say walk, because we want to recognize and include those among us who cannot literally walk. But walk in the way of was pointing to something we, no longer Christian identified, no longer Puritan, no longer Calvinist in our theology, no longer creedal as a religious community, pointing to something we still hold, however, as true today, which is that the purpose of our religious communities and our faith communities is to support us individually and as a community in growing in character. For to walk in the way of Jesus was a careful Reformation construction of Christians who were rejecting the solely sacramental practices at their time and as they understood it of the Roman and Anglican churches. It intentionally was expressing a desire to focus religious practice and community on the development of character, individually and in the development of character in those bonded connections among humans to develop communities of character, otherwise known as covenanting with each other in a faith community. And to be clear, I am not a scholar of either Western or Christian history, but the question of whether the Reformation was a migration or an exodus, we will have to leave to the experts. But it probably depends on the religious affiliation of the ones answering the question. And I want to be clear here, I am not making a statement either about Roman Catholicism or Anglicanism, or even about some of the things that came out of the Reformation, but just to point out the history as it was at that time. So back to this modern time, or this time we are in. I actually know a few rare folks who refuse to own computers and smartphones. I know many others, actually, who very intentionally limit their time on those devices. I know people who left Facebook years ago and refused to use it. I know people like myself who have never, ever ventured onto TikTok or Twitter. But what I also know is that right now, those things are a reality in our world. We know that communication is increasingly complicated and complex because of it. I think some days it would be nice if we could go back to that very upper class, 19th century social expectation that one gave a calling card and that was facilitated social interactions. Here's what I think our current calling cards would look like. Please communicate only by text. I will communicate by email Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. If you email me Saturday or Sunday or Tuesday or Thursday, I might get back to you, but maybe not. I will only answer the telephone if your name is recognizable and I like actually talking to another human being. We are all laughing, and yet I suspect that, like me, you recognize some of those responses in your own. It might be stretching the definition a bit, but from where I sit, our human paradigm shift into electronic connections rather than solely human ones combines some of both migration and exodus. And yet, without it, our many places church service could not happen. So I am grateful for that. Individually, it may be that we migrate. Culturally, it may be an exodus. I point to this question of exodus or migration because exodus does imply the forced aspect of leaving behind. And forced implies that we had no choice, no freedom in the choosing. It is a truth, I think, for us all, that we don't have much say in the changes that affect our lives. We don't really have a say in whether or not AI, artificial intelligence, but it seems to go by AI these days, so I'm trying to get used to that. And electronic communications will change the world around us. We don't have a say in that. They are, and they have already. Similarly, with the pandemic, it changed our world. It changed the way we think about the world around us. I doubt church or religious community will ever go back to a fully non-hybrid platform. For those among us who, for various reasons, need to remain physically isolated or distant, this connection is a gift, something we should all value. When I can attend a meeting in Vermont, while most of you are here in Massachusetts, it is a gift. So while we can't change the changes around us, what we do have is choice and freedom about how we respond, how we hold ourselves in relationship to the changes that are happening. We have these choices individually, and you have these choices as a community. I've been thinking about freedom this last week in preparation for this sermon, and I was thinking about Exodus, the story we heard this morning, the Passover story repeated in Jewish homes around the world, beginning this year on the evening of April 5th. A story of escape from unfreedom, slavery, to freedom in a wild and untamed desert or wilderness. And the next several books of 100 pages, hundreds of pages of Hebrew scripture are all about the time in the wilderness. Richard Rohr, a Franciscan contemplative, wrote this when he spoke of Jesus's time in the desert or wilderness. He spoke about it as he was speaking about the spiritual practices upon which Lent is based. He said this about the desert, and sometimes it's called the wilderness. He said, the desert is metaphorical. It's a mythical place of spiritual testing. He writes that the story is a beautiful telling about, and here I quote, the demons we all have to face to grow up, to become mature, end of quote. I am not trying, and I have no intention to reduce Passover nor Lent to their similarities, but for the purpose of today's sermon about freedom, both these spiritual celebrations have something to say to us about maturing and the role of freedom that we do have. So I recognize as I was thinking about freedom this week that I, having grown up in a middle-class, educated family of enough privilege in this culture, I have absolutely no idea what it is like. I take completely for granted certain freedoms. Political freedom, religious freedom, the ability to live where I want to move about freely, to choose my career or livelihood. I have so little understanding of what it must have been like for Rose, the Afghan family, the mother of the Afghan family I just spoke about, what it was like for Rose, who had been working as a teacher, to not be able to teach anymore. Some of you have had experiences of living in places where there is little or no political freedom. I have no idea what that is like. So the question of freedom for me, and perhaps for many of us, but not all of us, the question of freedom for me are the ways in which, with all this freedom in other areas of our lives, the freedom inside, the ways in which, because there are ways in which, because freedom is full of uncertainty, as I noted in one of our readings last week, and uncertainty makes us anxious and nervous and fearful. So all this freedom might make us occasionally anxious and fearful and uncertain in our insides, in our thinking about the world around us, in our desires and our expectations. We may not be quite as free as we think we are. We may not be as free as all those options online tell us we could be, because we become prisoners of those expectations, of those desires, of our own limited perspectives. I just remembered I skipped right over our congregational reading because I'm going to talk about the geese now. And we didn't read about the geese. We'll get there. Because the geese, as you know, when they migrate, they do so in a V formation. They have just arrived in Vermont this week. That's the V formation. We think they're all headed for Vermont, right? A little local hubris. And geese, they change their leaders. They do not have the same leader all the way through the migration. When the leader at the front gets tired, another goose takes the lead. That is the most tiring place to be. I think anybody who's been a leader in this congregation could probably raise their hand right now and go, yup. So they do a lot of things. They chatter, for one thing. They're very noisy, the geese. Now, it's presumed that they're encouraging one another, right? But I just want you to imagine this. As the geese are flying north, south, whatever time of year, they're going along. And the thing is, the geese in the back, they've been around for a while. And they've done this before. They've served their time at the beginning of that V. And they see this, there's a young one doing it right now. And they're going, can you see it now? And maybe they have cell phones and they're texting. You're going the wrong way. Here's this goose trying to fly along, right? You're going the wrong way. And he's going like this and trying to read the cell phone. You can see where this might create some disaster. Especially if they keep texting and, they don't do that. But we humans, and I know I pointed to some generational differences there, but in any number of ways, we do that because we have so much expectation of others sometimes, and sometimes of ourselves as well. And we often forget that perhaps in our freedom to be able to speak up, it might be useful instead to give it a little thought first. Because we don't want that lead goose flying down because they're busy reading the text instead of watching where they're going, and losing the momentum because we're all following behind them. And it is easy to think that there's only one way to go ahead. Because that's the way we went and it worked. Those of us who have had the opportunity to parent, especially as our offspring come of the age where they need to truly find their own ways, and we have to start to let go, and their ways aren't anything like ours. And it's hard to let go. And it's hard to watch them go another path. And yet, it could be that the goose at the head of that V knows that climate change has made it impossible to go the old route. And now we need to go a new route. Right now, you're all involved in this process in your own congregation here. You're looking toward an unknown future. You're in a metaphorical desert or wilderness. The world that ran church 25 years ago is not the same world that we're facing now. And how you will go forward will be different than the way you went forward before. And you're being asked right now to do something that's very different. You're being asked how you want to move forward spiritually. What path, when you walk in the way of, what path is it you wish to walk in the way of as a community? What do you hope the great-grandchildren of today's congregation, metaphorical, the metaphorical great-grandchildren of today's congregation, what kind of a people do you hope they will be? What kind of character do you hope to develop in yourselves and the future? Those are the questions before you, and they're a little bit strange. They're different from the questions of, what will the minister be? But you are up to this task. And I want to encourage you this morning to engage with this perhaps a bit unique process. As you move forward, give yourselves the freedom to let go of what was and just imagine something a little bit different. Who you want to be as a religious community, and that can flow in many ways. You knew how to be in the past, and it went well. You did amazing work here, and now it is time for something different. I encourage you not to build golden calves to your past, but to celebrate what you did, what worked, and even the mistakes and things that tripped you up or didn't work as well and maybe even failed. And then bring new light to this place of uncertainty, this desert, this wilderness, and enjoy its treasures, discover them. Bring new freedom to your own insides as you engage with this process. So may it be. Please rise in spirit and body as you are able. Number 155, circle around for freedom. And dancing, swaying is all welcome. Circle around for freedom, circle around for peace, for all of us in prison. Circle for release. We'll sing it twice. Circle for You may be seated. We extinguish our chalice. Daring to carry forward the vision of this free faith that freedom, reason, and justice will one day prevail in this nation, in this community, and across the earth. So may it be. Amen.